Hi, I'm Graham Gerst, founder of the Educational Liberty Alliance. We are dedicated to helping people organize and push for diversity of thought in K-12 schools. Along the lines of Eric's comments from the first panel, we're going to try to model a discussion with opposing viewpoints, which hopefully will provide insight into the issue that we are discussing. Our topic, as Ilana said, is whether teachers should advocate for social justice in the K-12 classroom. Traditionalists instinctively say no, while those of a more progressive bent are often in favor of it. What are some examples of social justice causes you've seen advocated for in the classroom? And how would you characterize what that something is that social justice is trying to achieve?
We studied some of the more traditional forms of migration of peoples that we think about, migrating from one country to another. But we also focused on forms of migration that were maybe more familiar and more current to some of my students living in Brooklyn. And so one of the things that we talked about was gentrification. And through focusing on gentrification, we were able to focus more broadly and explore more broadly other forms of displacement. And so one social justice issue that we were able to grapple with then was the social justice issue of forced displacement. And I think that the goal of focusing on that and discussing that with my students as it relates to social justice is making sure that students understand aspects and elements of fairness, aspects and elements of inclusion and belonging. And there's a lot of other sort of tentacles that has, but to be succinct, that's what I'd say as an example from my classroom.
Kind of the common characteristic. What is the, as I originally framed it, what is that something? We talk about social justice being advocating for changes to laws and policies, but what's the ultimate goal?
In my view, I think the ultimate goal of advocating for social justice is to create a society in which we are not only bringing people in from the margins, but we're also expanding the center and making a society that is more representative, reflective, and inclusive of all people, but especially for those who have traditionally been on the margins.
Tony, let's get your perspective of what are some examples that you've seen in the classroom or read about, and how would you characterize the something that these social justice causes are trying to achieve generally?
So in the last 5 to 10 years, these have come under certain kinds of frameworks like the importance of incorporating slavery reparations, free public housing, racial and gender quotas, as Garry stated, gentrification and collective financial issues, calling for the abolition of Western civilization principles under the guise of decentralizing whiteness, promoting Black Lives Matter protests and riots, adhering to the 1619 Project, hypersexualized education in elementary classrooms, and issues suggesting that national and global problems lay at the feet of a specific racial and sexual group. And the reason that I would characterize all of those as social justice issues is because this something to achieve in social justice is all built around closing perceived gaps in outcomes that have to be caused by harmful actions of another group, often with little statistical data proof other than that the gap exists, therefore there must be some type of malicious intent and action. That's why it's social justice and not advocating specifically for justice. Advocating for justice means every individual is treated equally and fairly under the law, whereas social justice says that's not getting the job done. And so therefore we have to advocate for other means in order to solve those societal issues that we see present via historical or present collective gaps.
If we give teachers and administrators license to advocate for social justice, it would seem to give them the ability to select which causes they deem appropriate. Is that discretion concerning, or do we trust our educators to make those decisions about which causes to advocate?
The key issue here to consider is that really who's swinging the bat of deciding what issues to discuss is incredibly important to discuss. I don't really want someone with my complete opposite political views telling my child how they should think or feel about certain issues, and vice versa. Someone who has completely opposite political views from me probably doesn't want me giving all of my students my unique perspective on history and all of the opinions that come with it. And that's really key to this conversation. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that anytime we give someone power to do something, once the power changes hands to someone who I may disagree with, that becomes a key issue.
I think what's really important in the way that I see it is that there are groups of people, many of whom, I mean, all of whom, because schools are one of the only compulsory institutions that we have in our society, we see our students represent everyone, right? And because of that, it's important for us to make sure that in the classroom, we are recognizing all of our students' humanity. And part of that involves, I think, condemning certain things and making sure that certain things are not on the table.
What we think K through 12 education should be trying to foster and develop in students.
So I think a lot of what I view as social justice in the classroom sort of revolves around my stipulation that good educators and good education helps prepare students to repair the world and bring it closer to what ideally we would like for it to be, sort of, in a normative sense.
Teaching students a series of values without a comprehensive tool belt of skills and virtue cripples the student post-graduation. So we see this really with a lot of Chicago and LA graduates right now who statistically really don't have an ability to read past a second grade level, but could tell you many aspects of social emotional learning. So how are they supposed to keep a job and rear a family? And this really correlates to what Garry is saying as far as repairing the world. I would question the authority of really anyone in education to define certain issues that need to be brought to the table. And really in recognizing historical gaps and what the solutions are to those gaps. As a teacher, it's very easy for me to select which information I want my students to see regarding repairing certain historical situations or gaps in general. Therefore, it's really incredibly important that when I'm talking about the value of education, that it's done through the objective lens that, as Garry said, students have to become better people and they have to go out and they have to make the society a better place. I think that it's perhaps just a little more centered on kind of the classical Western civilization ideas and values of individualism.
How do we determine, particularly in our current society where different people, I think, probably have different value systems, how do we determine which values the school should be using in the school system? Who should be making that determination?
Or I really would suggest kind of a minimalist approach to how the state is teaching values, encouraging things like family and the home, make sure that we're keeping our parents really at the top as far as teaching values to our students. Now, of course, that's not going to completely cut it. Education doesn't come without virtue. It doesn't come without an understanding of beauty and value. I would suggest that there are some values that are objectively better than others. And within that, within the last 10 years or so, we've seen quite a divergence in education in K through 12. We've seen a suggestion that one of the best ways to go about life is with an extreme adherence to the collective, to the group, and that all of your virtues and all of your sins come from that identity. And I disagree. I think that's objectively a worse way to go about teaching a student rather than focusing on individualism, which Western civilization was built upon and thrived through.
I think that schools should be fostering values in students. I think where I diverge from Tony's perspective is that I think I'm kind of on the other end of things. I think while there's an importance in focusing on individualism as well, I think that the collective should be the priority. We hear the terms equality and equity kind of brought into conversations a lot. I think that equity specific, the way that I think of equity is not necessarily giving everyone the same thing, but giving different demographics what it is that they need to fulfill their purpose or maybe a broader collective purpose. And I think that that is one of the values that in a lot of my work, I propone and promote. And then that's one of the values that I try to work through with my students a lot when I was in the classroom as well.
We're talking about values in the schools, and we also want to encourage independent thought. Is there any potential conflict there? I mean, are we encouraging students to make their own decisions about what values they want to incorporate into their own lives?
I think we can show them through the selection of materials and resources what sort of placing some values over others, how that's resulted for certain people throughout history. But I think that to tell them that this value is what they must, is the one that they must hold dear, might be a little outside of our purview.
I'm more than happy with presenting students with a very fact-based view of history and then letting them derive the values that they see from it. I have no problem with showing my students, the horrors of Nazi Germany and what that ideology did, and also the horrors of communism and what that ideology did, and the millions that both ideologies left dead. I would caution the idea of just giving students kind of a smorgasbord of values and then saying, go pick one. They're kids, and kids have pretty poor judgment. I really enjoy getting to work with a lot of kids who want candy all the time. And I'm sure that we could give students candy for dinner and say that certain value systems, you pick which one you want. Obviously, the kid's going to go eat the candy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's best for them. I do think there are some value systems that are objectively better than others. And by objectively, I mean that can fit into instructional time. Objective values that at the end of the day do not encroach on the rights of a person.
It is important for us to sort of lay out for students the benefits or maybe drawbacks of different value systems.
Sure.
As evidenced by different, events in history. And I think that we're in agreement there. I'd like to hear more a little bit about what you said about helping students understand that there are some value systems that are objectively better, because I actually really agreed with that. And I'm wondering, it feels maybe slightly contradictory to some of the other things that you voiced earlier.
Yeah, Tony,
Can we good? Yeah, absolutely. So when I suggest that we should be teaching that some value systems are objectively better, I am talking about the fundamentals that built Western civilization. I am suggesting that the Western civilization that focused primarily on the foundations of justice, pure and simple with no additives, that's really what I'm focusing on, and finding that through the beauty of the arts. You're never going to get education to a space where it can be completely unbiased. It can't happen. There is no law that we can pass. There are no amount of cameras in classrooms that are going to keep every teacher so obsessively neutral that they're not going to get any moral value system from that class.
Is enlisting students, and Garry, maybe this gets to your comment earlier about repairing the world, so I'll start with you. Is enlisting students an appropriate way to get those changes made?
I think it depends on what you mean by enlisting. I think bringing students into some of those discussions is a really important step for us to take. I'd like to think that it's important for us to help get students on board in terms of what it might look like to repair our society and to make it more inclusive, to make it a better society. I take a little bit less issue with involving students in maybe specific causes around social justice, because I think, Tony, you and I might disagree on the idea of neutrality. And I think that there is not necessary. I think that neutral space is a lot smaller than we tend to think it is. And so I think that by remaining silent or leaving certain things outside of the classroom space, what we're not exercising is neutrality. What we're exercising is sort of the status quo or maintenance, especially when we're talking about social justice.
The last thing that you said, really interesting, and the idea that silence and what can be kept out of classroom discussion could be considered as bias towards that event. I would caution that providing a certain emotionally charged topic to the classroom for my students to kind of be whipped up into a frenzy, as students are wont to do, is a very dangerous thing. And putting my students in an environment where I tell them that it's good for them to discuss things and get, in a lot of cases, as we've seen in a lot of these social justice advocacy cases, students are encouraged to discuss the topic, to kind of whip themselves up into a frenzy. And then you have this very strange mob-esque mentality in the classroom. So in two schools pop into my mind, one in Manhattan and one in Philadelphia, in which they were talking about a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and kind of the things that played into the death of George Floyd. And within this classroom setting, there were students in both classrooms who dissented, who didn't agree, who didn't like where this was going. And the other students in the classroom ended up shouting these particular students down until they were forced to admit that they agreed with the majority.
Kind of agree with you, Tony. These conversations are important, but they do kind of, they work students up. And I think part of what we can do is minimize the working up that happens in these conversations and encourage students to move to action. What those actions are things that we can sort of guide and we can help students with. It would almost be disingenuous for them to not want to take action if we're, sort of reviewing things that have happened in history, are currently happening to them and their classmates, to just kind of intellectualize it and then leave it, and stop there. I think that might be a little bit, that might be too much for me to do as an educator. I'll just say that.
So I just want to respond in two quick things here. So first of all, I am absolutely all for encouraging empathy. We holistically agree on that. Wholeheartedly agree on that. I'm all for making sure that my students understand that based on the set of shoes you're wearing, things can be very different, and we need to understand people are coming from very different backgrounds with very different experiences. Where that ends for me is suggesting that as a collective group and a society group, because someone is coming from a place of perhaps some kind of trouble, some historical lack, just to put a word there to kind of illustrate the negative, that someone is at fault. I think there's a big difference between teaching empathy and then teaching there is empathy that requires someone else to kind of make allocations kind of against their right.
I didn't take that. I did not mean by that there should be some things that we don't discuss at all. I think what I meant by that was that there are some things that in our discussions, teachers can and should condemn.
So depending on your spot on the political compass, that's going to look different. Somewhat like, if we're just going to go ahead and pick right out of the bucket, like the trans issue in elementary education is really big at the moment. You might have one teacher that thinks that the transgender argument in elementary is tantamount to child abuse, where someone on the other side might suggest that it's incredibly important that trans children at that age are included and represented well. And by included, I mean that those certain actions and things that they're going through are rationalized and made normal. And I just want to clarify that as a teacher, me deciding what should or shouldn't be universally condemned on that intense of a political topic could get dangerous at some point.
And I don't think that my suggestion that there should be some things that are universally condemnable, I did not mean in that to say that each teacher should decide for themselves what those things are.
If one believes that either social justice advocacy in the classroom is improper in any way, shape, or form, or one believes that involving students in social justice causes in some sense is okay, but there are guidelines, what do we need to do in the schools administratively? What can the schools do either to prevent it altogether, given the discretion teachers have in their own classrooms, or to control it so that it's something that's acceptable? Garry, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we can do is we can move towards preparing teachers and developing teachers to facilitate these conversations in ways that don't become, so that they don't become huge conflagrations, right? The other thing that I think we can do is we can begin to sort of weave in standards that help build certain competencies in our students that would bring about social justice, even if that doesn't necessarily mean we're directly engaging in social justice outright all the time. So for instance, I believe the new name is Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching Tolerance, has a list of standards that are around inclusion, social justice, and the like.
I would really encourage, since we're talking about advice to administrations, I would encourage administrators to kind of take a second look at how they're handling professional developments and classrooms within staff meetings. It's become a really common policy to suggest that there are voices that you want people to speak up, but then when those voices speak up, the answers that are given are very dismissive and one-off. I see this in a lot of things like racial equity trainings and things like this. And I really would encourage that if we're to bring open discussion about complicated issues such as, social justice to the classroom, we first have to make sure that our teachers are modeling the same thing. which means being able to foster an environment where the teachers in your school are allowed to openly disagree with things without, suggesting that they keep quiet, which is something that we do see in a lot of public schools. There have been a lot of emails and conversations between principals and teachers, dozens that I've spoken to in the last couple of months, who were told to keep quiet when they disagreed. And I think that for the sake of ideological diversity in general, especially regarding how we're going to model this ideological diversity to our students, it's important that we make sure our teachers know that regardless of their opinion, they're not just supposed to sit in staff meetings and be quiet.